Hey, based on an almost true story, fans, it's Lemmy with episode 7, Charlie Wilson's War. Happy New Year, by the way. Well, it's not too happy so far. Hopefully it gets better. So the book was by George Crile, 2003. It came out. It's subtitled The Extraordinary Story of the Largest Covert Operation in History. And really, it is one of the most important and incredible stories in the post-World War II era, not just in this country, but it impacted the world at the end of the day, as we'll see. The movie Charlie Wilson's War came out in 2007, so 4 years after the book. It stars Tom Hanks as Charlie Wilson, Julia Roberts as Joanne Herring, the late, great Philip Seymour Hoffman as Gust with a T, Avrakotos, the CIA operative in Pakistan running the Afghanistan operation. So what the movie does portray, and we'll get into how short it is, I believe it gets mostly right in any important historical sense, right? Including the more outrageous portrayals of Charlie Wilson's life, which aren't historically important necessarily, but they're true. And he's just a colorful character you really couldn't make up. The only things it didn't include are just, or didn't get right or stuff it left out. So some of these are actually pretty important and we'll get to them. What's odd is, unlike some of the prior movies where I've talked about, their runtime was unnecessarily long, the runtime in this movie is like an hour and 42 minutes. So there was room to cover a couple other things, but I reached out to Hanks and asked him to join the pod. He hasn't returned my calls, so we're just going to have to guess at shit. The subtitle of the book, as I said, The Extraordinary Story of the Largest Covert Operation in History. It refers to that covert operation. Specifically, it was what we now call a proxy war, right? In short, and very short, the then Soviets invade Afghanistan in 1979. And while we did not have soldiers in theater fighting the Soviets, that would have been World War III, we were funding the Afghans and arming them to fight back and do as much harm as possible to the Soviets along the way. And I'll mention this a couple times in this episode. This lasted for 10 years. Okay, so this really was one of the most important histories, as I said, in world history, actually, not just U.S. history, since World War II. And if you believe that this war contributed to the fall of the Soviet Union, which I believe it did. As I said, the war lasted a decade and it was a significant drain on Soviet financial and military resources. Although I could also argue just Reagan's buildup militarily was something that the Soviets couldn't keep up with despite their best efforts, even if this war didn't happen. So we'll call it a 50-50 contribution right there. Unfortunately, this story did not end with the end of this war in Afghanistan or the wall coming down, as you'll figure out with 9/11, the rise of Vladimir Putin and the war in Ukraine. And the epilogue in this book is actually called Unintended Consequences. And honestly, it could have been the subtitle of the book, not just the epilogue. On that note, historically, for young people, what's the difference between the Soviets and the Russians? Because the book refers to the Soviets throughout because that's what they were at the time. Okay. Now we talk about Russia under Putin. The USSR was the Soviet Union, the United Soviet Socialist Republics, until 1991. The USSR included 15 countries, comprised of 14 smaller countries, including Ukraine and several of the stands, but not Afghanistan, plus Mother Russia. So the USSR dissolved and left just Russia and those Eastern European countries, the Baltic states, the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, etc. So important border discussion that I like to do when we're in far-flung parts of the world. As I said, the war started in 1979 when the Soviets, quote unquote, rolled into Afghanistan. And if you looked at a map, you wouldn't see today Russia bordering Afghanistan. Sip of coffee. The crossing into and subsequently out of Afghanistan when the Soviets left was called Friendship Bridge, and it was between the aforementioned Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. So if you look at that map today, you'd see Afghanistan bordered by Iran to the west, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan to the north, and Pakistan to the east and south. That last one, Pakistan, will be similar in geographic importance in this story as it was in the episode about the outpost during the Afghan war, where Al-Qaeda were coming into Afghanistan from Pakistan. Same thing essentially was happening here, except instead of just, weapons basically were being transported from Pakistan into Afghanistan up and over those mountain passes. So it's going to be very similar to the story in The Outpost in that geographic importance of Pakistan and the relationship with Afghanistan, like the Kunar province, in the northeast section of Afghanistan. All right, before we get into the movie versus the book, let's talk about versus history, as I like to do. What else is going on at the time? Okay. Right out of the gate, one of the things that neither the book nor the movie delves into is why the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Well, it's for them, it was a border country at that point. And I had to do some independent internet research to get some guidance on this because I said neither the book nor the movie addresses it. So I can't say one was right or more right or wrong than the other. There was a Marxist/communist government there that was increasingly unstable. So they probably liked the government at first, but they were being destabilized due to some already starting Islamic insurgency. And the Soviets wanted a friendly socialist state on the border. So they invaded to overthrow President Amin and install a more compliant leader, something the U.S. has done a handful of times in Central and South America and in Asia in the 20th century. A few episodes coming up on that topic. As far as the U.S. is concerned, generally, the covert operation specifically, this is an insane period in United States history, and candidly not a pretty one, okay? But let's start off right in 1979 with the invasion of Afghanistan, okay? Jimmy Carter is president. The invasion was followed immediately by the 1980 Moscow Olympics boycott by the Americans and around 60 other countries, including China, Japan, and most of the Islamic countries. Some Western European countries like Great Britain, France, Italy, and Sweden did not boycott. They went and competed. You had the Iran hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy in late 1979. That lasted 444 days, ending with the Algiers Accords, which included a stipulation, wait for it, that the U.S. would not intervene politically or militarily in Iranian internal affairs. I'm no defender of Iranian leadership at any level, but like Haiti and a bunch of other countries stuck in the economic mud, we've been messing with Iran, and by that I mean working to destabilize the country for at least 75 years. So what else was going on? We had the FBI ABSCAM scandal, where a U.S. senator and 6 congressmen accepted bribes from undercover agents posing as representatives of an Arab business in a sting operation for things like legislative and immigration assistance, cash on the barrelhead, right? One of those caught in the sting was Texas Representative John Murtha. In the book, I can't remember if the movie addressed this, but the powerful House Speaker at the time, Tip O'Neill, got Charlie Wilson on the ethics committee overseeing the investigation, and that got Murtha off. He was put on there specifically to dissuade the other members of the ethics committee from prosecuting Murtha. There's a Forrest Gump element to Charlie Wilson's character, which is coincidental because that character was played by Tom Hanks as well, in that he seemed to be involved in a few of the most important decisions and events during his time in office, even though he was just one of 435 representatives from a very tiny district in Texas. It was kind of the magic of Charlie Wilson. So we had ABSCAM. At the same time, you had the Iran-Contra affair under Reagan involving the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, right, who Reagan saw as communists. So we supported the Contras, who were also bringing crack into the U.S., and we were training Contras militarily, but also directly. The CIA was blowing up bridges. So this was a little bit of a proxy war, but a little bit too far in terms of boots on the ground involvement to fully qualify. But the main issue became selling arms to Iran, using the profits to fund the Contras, because this didn't have the support of Congress. They wanted more money than Congress was approving. Now, this is a really important, or maybe interesting part of the book, because while Congress kept cutting funding for Nicaragua, the more kind of negative, unnerving, uncomfortable information started coming out of that region in terms of the CIA's involvement. Charlie Wilson was able to continue getting more and more money for Afghanistan every year. So the Iran-Contra and the crack epidemic might get separate episodes, but they're going to be covered. I'm working on matching the books with the movies as we speak. What else? In 1982, Israel invades Lebanon, called either the Lebanon War or the Second Israeli Invasion of Lebanon. The U.S. and other countries sent some peacekeeping forces to Lebanon, which led to 1983, the Beirut bombing in Lebanon of the Marine barracks that killed 220 Marines, 241 Americans overall, 307 people total. Reagan pulled the troops out. But before that, Israel allowed Lebanese Christians into the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in September 1982, who then slaughtered hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinian and Lebanese civilians. Now, Charlie Wilson happened to have a trip planned to visit these camps, and that visit followed the massacre, and it really forever changed his feelings towards Israel, though he remained politic. Up until that point, a big deal is made in the story that though he had, 4 Jews in his district, he was one of the most passionate supporters of Israel in Congress at that time. But seeing the slaughter and realizing what had actually happened, despite the rhetoric, he was disturbed, and it kind of changed his relationship with Israel forever. He already didn't love India because of that country's history at the time with the Soviet Union. So embracing Pakistan, a country he'd visited when he was in the Navy, was less difficult, especially after Israel was taken down a notch, in his opinion, in Lebanon. In 1986, Reagan tries to kill Gaddafi, Libya's leader, in a bombing that missed him. The same year was the Chernobyl nuclear plant disaster, which was a Soviet disaster because Ukraine, where Chernobyl was and still is, was still part of the USSR. It's in northern Ukraine. So sidebar, the book, although it points out the long-term failure of this victory in the epilogue, references prior CIA quote-unquote successes in Iran and Guatemala. And I beg to differ. And I'm going to make a deep analysis on that in certain episodes if I can get, again, the right books and movies to talk about it. Because really, just like this, it only seems successful in a short-term objective perspective. But if you look at the long-term unintended consequences, those were humanitarian disasters, and I would argue political disasters, and where do I come up with this? All these sudden moments of relevance in old stories is, look what we're doing in Venezuela and about to do in Iran. And this is just history repeating itself over and over again, and not in a successful way. For instance, there was another one where the CIA was involved in Sukarno's overthrow in Indonesia that led to Suharto seizing power, resulting in horrific mass killings. That was us. We did that. We put all these awful people in place. So keep Venezuela, Iran, Nigeria, Syria, all these places we're bombing right now in your mind as you listen to the rest of this story through the end. First of all, just important to clarify, in case you haven't really thought about it, what's a proxy war? Vietnam and Afghanistan were proxy wars for 2 different people. That's where like a major power like the U.S. or the then Soviet Union provides money and arms and training to one of the armies in the war without actually putting their own soldiers directly into the fight. And often that major country tries to hide its identity and involvement completely, even though people kind of know it's going on, right? So like our war in Vietnam, where we had boots on the ground, was a proxy war for the Soviet Union, as they supplied all of the above to the North Vietnamese in their war against us. This is actually a really important part of the story because it was a rallying cry behind the U.S. support of the Mujahideen to pay the Soviet Union back for the pain they caused us in Vietnam. This was a tool Charlie used to build support, and it was very powerful in communicating the need to send more money to the Afghan resistance. Congressmen really liked this idea, this opportunity to hit the Soviets back. Remember, if the invasion of Afghanistan was 1979, the fall of Saigon was 1975, I think. So really not that long before. The story in the movie, let's get to it. So Carter, as president, approved the first covert operation in Afghanistan, which was the CIA providing aid to the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets, which is the whole story in Charlie Wilson's war. It was tiny at the time when Charlie found out about it. It was a $5 million budget, and you can see in the movie there's a line where he says, "How much are we giving them?" And someone says $5 million. He says, "Double it." This is where it gets crazy just from a political perspective. Charlie gets on these committees that would allow him to champion this proxy war. Again, very Forrest Gumpish. Like in the movie, you see Charlie talking to that aide, finding out it's $5 million. He says, double it. That's relatively impressive, but not when compared to the amount that it got to in the end. Remember, this lasted 10 years and the money just kept going up. So back to the committees. His first appointment was on the Defense Appropriations Committee, comprised of 12 guys that basically determined how much money to give the CIA without any further oversight, at least not details. So he was able to get the money, but to whom did he give it? So for a proxy war to work, remain hidden, you have to hide your contribution. So money was one thing, but that meant they couldn't use U.S.-made weapons and give those to the Afghans that could then later be recovered by the Soviets. That would insinuate to the Soviets, we are at war with the United States. So whatever weapons you had, you also, problem two, you couldn't send them directly to the Mujahideen because the Soviets would see that you were delivering weapons to Afghanistan, right, in U.S. airships or whatever. So Pakistan solved the second issue, and the character, Julia Roberts' character, Joanne Herring, and her relationship with the president of Pakistan, which was true. I really can't figure out how that happened, but she was just such a bold personality and a socialite. She became very close friends with Zia and ended up championing this cause and pushing Charlie to do more and more and more. But anyway, the weapons would be given to the Pakistanis, and the weapons would then be carried from Pakistan by mule up and over through the mountains to Afghanistan. That was the path. What did the Pakistanis want in return? They wanted F-16s, which just happened to be made in Texas. So this was a win-win politically for Charlie, right? Texas makes more F-16s, gets paid, and the Pakistanis get the planes they want. Also, Pakistanis have their own interest in solving this problem. There are about 1 million Afghani refugees flooding into Pakistan as the Soviets just fly in and start slaughtering people and blowing up buildings and infrastructure. So kicking the Soviets out has a direct benefit to Pakistan, who doesn't want all those refugees. So back to Charlie's relationship with one country, Israel. Israel had old Soviet weapons. A lot of countries in the Middle East did, actually. So sending those to Afghanistan via Pakistan was a no-brainer. How could it be traced back to the United States? These are Soviet weapons. So the CIA bought those weapons from Israel, captured ironically during that aforementioned war with Lebanon. And that was some of the contribution that went through Pakistan into Afghanistan. Here's an important point I may bring up again at the end. The book makes the comment early on that Afghanistan is not so much a country nor a people, but a collection of tribes, often warring tribes. So I bring that up now because choices were made about who among the tribe were going to get the weapons. And Joanne, yes, was that influential, like giving him to Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And remember that name if you don't know it already. So there was another character in the movie who was in the Afghan leadership prior to the invasion, Mojadedi, and he was calling for resistance against the Soviets in 1979. He hated Hekmatyar, and he was saying he's a dangerous fundamentalist. But Zia in Pakistan also favored Hekmatyar, which is probably why Joanne championed him to Charlie. And Mojadedi actually said, America will be sorry someday if it doesn't stop favoring him. And post 9/11, I'm not saying he was involved in 9/11, but in post 9/11, the war in Afghanistan, his point would be proven. In fact, U.S. actually tried to kill Hekmatyar with a drone in 2002. They missed him, but so this guy was backed in one shadow war and would become our enemy in the war on terror. The law of unintended consequences, again, should just be the subtitle of the book and the movies. Okay. So Charlie keeps raising more money for the CIA operation, buying more weapons and ammo for the Mujahideen. He doesn't care where they're made. He's talking to China. He's talking to Israel. He's talking to Turkey. He's talking to Egypt, so long as they aren't traced back to the U.S. Now, that's saying politics makes strange bedfellows, to paraphrase Shakespeare, right? The problem for the Mujahideen isn't just weapons and ammo. The Soviets have a helicopter called the Hind with a shell that can't be penetrated by any weapons the Afghans are currently being sent. So they're shooting. picking off Soviets, maybe doing, setting up some small bombs here and there. But then a Hind will come through and just slaughter hundreds of Afghans, destroy infrastructure, and there's nothing the Afghans can do to stop it. And the movie portrays just how powerful that helicopter is. Now, and this becomes literally the underlying story for the whole 10-year period of funding the war is, yes, we're funding them, but we have to figure out how to get the Afghans a weapon to stop the Hind, or we're never going to win. And winning becomes the goal for Charlie, even though for Gust, it wasn't clear initially that that was the goal. He was more like, hey, let's just keep sucking the Soviets dry as long as this takes. Both end up kind of happening. Okay. So in this search for this magic weapon that can take down the Hind, again, the Hind has a skin, right, that cannot be penetrated by any weapons the Afghans currently have, but there are weapons out there. Okay. One is the Orlikon. I think it's mentioned once or twice in the movie, and I believe it was made in Sweden. Charlie is obsessed with the Orlikon because he believes correctly that he could take down the Soviet Hind. The problem, Gust tells him, is you'd kill 10 mules just trying to get that heavy thing up and over the mountains of Pakistan, and it's not mobile. So you'd plan it, you set it up, you get one shot at a Hind, and then the other helicopters would set your location, blow up the soldiers and the gun, and that would be the end of it. Too big and bulky, too immobile, couldn't really hide it or transport it very well. And that is really the connective tissue in the rest of the story, aside from Charlie's personal foibles, which never end, is just getting this weapon to solve the Soviet Hind problem. So now Charlie's 10 million is $50 million, let's say, in the story, which again is incredible because Iran-Contra is unfolding. Oliver North is testifying. Congress wants to neuter the CIA generally and covert operations specifically. The famous William Casey, who was head of the CIA at this point, he tries to actually pressure Charlie into diverting some of his Afghan money that was getting approved easily to the Contra program. Charlie says, hell no. So we have money, but it's being sprayed around without much thought and with mixed results. So enter the character Mike Vickers. He's the young CIA analyst in the movie. They find him in the park playing chess with 3 different people at the same time, somewhat blind. I don't know if that story actually happened, but they're trying just to establish that this was a brilliant guy. And he was, and I'll get back to this in a second, still is. He's still around. So at the time, Egypt is pitching their weapons for sale. Israel's pitching their weapons. A lot of money's going around. The Egyptian weapons, as I believe is shown in the movie, just in a little bit of dialogue, appear to have decayed while in storage beyond the point of being functional. So they have these old weapons in storage in Egypt. It's like, yeah, we're happy to sell them to you. They're great. They're great shape. Well, they weren't in great shape. So net all of this, what Vickers does, what he brings to the table is he breaks down all the weapons of choice in the world, including making some originally out of a lab. The money's available, and he lays out exactly what weapons and how much ammo, based literally on how many rounds are fired per minute. He says, this is where they should be allocated. These are the weapons and ammo that should be allocated. This is where they should be allocated to. And this is a huge change in the war. And he's such a smart guy, and he's so confident in the plan. By the end of the book, he actually retires like 3 years early from the CIA, 3 years before the war is going to end, because he's so confident that as this plan rolls out and the weapons he's telling Gust and Charlie to order or distribute to the right people, they're going to win. It's like when you see in chess and someone, has not called checkmate, reaches their hand across the table and shakes hand because they know within X number of moves, they're going to win the game. The other person sees it and that person concedes. That's the way Vickers saw this war playing out with his strategy. Okay. So eventually the magic weapon was called the Stinger, made ironically, after all these efforts to remain behind the scenes, by American corporation still around called General Dynamics in Southern California. They just had all the markings that could identify the manufacturer and the country of origin removed from the product. It was that, if you see the movie, it's a shoulder rocket launcher about 8 feet long, a giant tube that they could put up on their shoulder, shoot it. It's got high technology in it. It follows the helicopter and doesn't have to be shot perfectly, but it'll trace that helicopter if it's close enough and literally blow it out of the sky with one shot. And that really happened. And that turned the war in favor of the Afghans distinctly. They were causing the Soviets an enormous amount of financial pain because I can't remember the ratio, but let's say that Stinger cost, $600,000. Well, one Hind cost $20 million, right? So huge return on investment if the only thing you want to do is cause the Soviets pain. And sure enough, the Soviets got tired and broke and decided to leave Afghanistan, documented in the Geneva Accords, which provided for the withdrawal of the Soviets, but it didn't provide anything for post-war governance of Afghanistan. And I think you know how it worked out. But back to the tribes and the warlords killing each other and fighting for power, 9/11 and the U.S. war on terror in Afghanistan, of which the episode The Outpost was a part. I'm going to get into movie versus reality, but I'll start with a speech that Gus gives at the end of the movie because it's most relevant right now. And I don't have it quoted directly, but what happened is the Soviets are out. Gus and Charlie go out on the deck of an apartment where they're drinking and celebrating. And Gus warns him. He says, you need to build roads. You need to build schools. Give the young people something to believe in besides jihad. And he quotes the percentage of males in that region that are under the age of 14. And he said, it's insane. And Gus is trying to make the point that this is a recipe for disaster. Foreshadow, right? So the next scene, Charlie is in an appropriations committee. Instead of being attended by all 12 enthusiastic supporters, there's just a few guys there. And he's trying to make the case for money to rebuild Afghanistan. And the amounts he's actually getting are pathetically small. No one cares anymore, Charlie. That's what he keeps hearing, right? So it's all political short-term thinking. And 10 years later, we end up paying for it for 20 years. Let's do some movie versus reality analysis. Who was Charlie Wilson? He was a liberal by Texas standards. From Texas. He was of modest means, unlike all the other blue blood politicians that he cavorts with on a daily basis. He went to the Naval Academy, graduated 8th from the bottom. So not a great student, but a very, very active reader and self-taught on military history to a degree that ended up being important in how he lobbied for support for the Afghans. But mostly he was just a very tall, handsome, charming guy from a small district in Texas where there were more churches than people. And they must have used camera angles or short actors because the director went out of his way to make Tom Hanks look much taller than he is. And they didn't do that with Jesse Plemons in Killers of the Flower Moon and his Tom White character. Or did they do that in The Catcher Was a Spy, where Paul Rudd is not tall, but Mo Berg was a pretty big guy, at least for the time. What else did the movie show that you may not believe, but was true? The Vegas party, the hot tub, the cocaine rap, that was all true. And Charlie was able to, the way Charlie beat that rap was accurate. I think there were more dalliances than the movie highlighted, but that would have just been kind of gravy, I think. I think they make the point that he was a bit of a playboy. His partner, co-conspirator in the Afghan Shadow War, was a CIA agent, as I said, named Gust with a T, Avrakotos, American-born but of Greek descent in a suburb of Philadelphia, played brilliantly, again, by Philip Seymour Hoffman. Gus was also a partier and a womanizer, and even more blue-collar than Charlie. And we brought this up in Catcher Was a Spy, that for reasons I'm not fully aware of, the covert services in the U.S. from the beginning were very blue blood, very Ivy League. And Gus, the son of Greek immigrants, couldn't stand that. He knew he didn't really fit in and he wouldn't be treated the same way. He didn't like those people. Charlie was less insecure and capable of moving in the most upper-crust circles, but he was still pretty down to earth, and despite being an out-of-control drinker and womanizer. But all that combined, Gus and Charlie ended up getting along very well, even though what really turned the tide in their relationship was Gus believing Charlie could do what he said. Initially, he was like, who are you? Because another underlying theme in this story that is true is that there's been no other time in history where a single congressman was running an operation, getting the funding and allocating the funding, and kind of one person removed from CIA operatives that he wasn't even supposed to be in a room alone with historically. But anyway, they got along great. Joanne Herring, played by Julia Roberts, very, very far right, uber Christian, socialite, and activist, Daughters of the Revolution or something like that. And if you didn't read the book, you'd find her character also not believable, but they don't do justice to the influence that she ended up wielding. Like the whole relationship with the Pakistan president is Zia ul Haq, right? Who killed his predecessor, Bhutto, though Joanne keeps saying at dinner parties, he did not kill Bhutto. She's trying to say he was arrested, he was tried, he was hung. What he did was illegal. Okay, whatever. But she was a bigger than life character, and she was literally the champion of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Why? Well, a couple reasons, but I'll give you one main one. This was still peak Cold War, and communists were synonymous with Satan in the 80s to the religious right, which she was. And I think that's the main reason, or one of the main reasons she championed Mujahideen, right? Even though, what was their religion? Whatever it was, she hated the Soviets more, and she saw an opportunity to take them down a notch. I think all these things are portrayed well in the movie, as is Tip O'Neill putting Charlie on the ethics committee, again, to protect John Murtha, Joanne's relationship with Zia in Pakistan. Charlie did, it's in the movie, he asked to be put on the Kennedy Center board. He jokes that it's to get free tickets, but again, it's topical today, so I make that point. The fact that Pakistan was taking in millions of refugees from Afghanistan was accurate, and the trip to Afghan refugee camps that broke Charlie's heart and really motivated him to take the side of the Mujahideen against the Soviets. What the movie didn't get right, I don't think they got anything wrong. They just consolidated stories as they do, give speeches to make points, as all of these movies do. I've made that point in the past. What they did was they just left stuff out or didn't emphasize enough some of the details that were of interest at the time, I guess. For one, Charlie was a member of the House, again, from a small district in Texas. For him to rise to power he did is just really incredibly rare. Not historically important, but just from the perspective, again, of appreciating the backstory to who achieved what. It's a miracle he did what he did. I think it's really unprecedented, right? Also, for him to be essentially running CIA operations in a foreign country as a congressman, working directly with a CIA operative, is pushing the boundaries of really rules within Congress. It just wasn't supposed to happen. So just the fact that he was on both the House Appropriations Committee and the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee as a junior congressman in 1979, he'd been serving just for 6 years. That alone was insane. And that goes back to my Forrest Gump reference. I'm not sure how it happened. He just kept getting these appointments. He was well liked, and it ended up giving him enormous amounts of power. He was also on the Intelligence Committee, inexplicably. Between these, he had the wherewithal to run with the Afghanistan cover operation, at least from the funding side, but he got way more involved in that, right? Charlie himself personally didn't have a lot of money, so he definitely leveraged his role as congressman to get sweet junkets around the world. He wasn't shy about that. He was always bringing a girlfriend, beautiful, sometimes scantily clad, which caused some political issues in the Muslim-dominated area of the world that he kept traveling to, okay? Just think about that. That didn't fly a lot of times. And other times, his host looked the other way. Charlie did go to those refugee camps a few times, and not in the movie, but in the book was he always donated blood. The movie skipped that small thing. Not historically relevant, but interesting. It really bonded him with the soldiers and the leaders running the war over there. Charlie tells a story in the movie, sad, about his dog in the flower bed and the neighbor and the election that came up. That's in the book, and that is true. The hot tub, as I said, and the cocaine party, how we got out of that, all true. Bringing a girlfriend from Texas that loved to belly dance. That was her passion. Brought her to Egypt, where she performed for the leadership over there. Insane. That also happened. What they might have left out, this Afghan operation almost got mixed up in the Iran-Contra debacle. I think they left it out. Sometimes they can sneak in just a very quick reference, and if you blink, you missed it. But as I said, it was going on at the same time. And one of the miracles of Charlie Wilson's war was that while Congress was souring on CIA covert operations and trying to shut down the Nicaragua program, Charlie kept getting more and more money for Afghanistan. Now, that almost came crashing down because, for reasons I never figured out, at one point, Oliver North wants to run money through the bank account used by the CIA to fund the Afghan operations. I say, for whatever reason, probably to hide the trail of the money. And he actually does it. he forces it through. Now, the money's only there for 2 days, but it came dangerously close to bringing Charlie and Gus into that debacle and then bringing their operation to a halt. You can imagine how quickly that could have happened. Another major plot line that was skipped was that the Pakistani president Zia did a quiet deal with Reagan where he said, we'll help you kick butt in Afghanistan, but you have to look the other way while we develop a nuclear bomb. This was an issue in the region. Everyone accusing Pakistan of trying to do it. They denied it. We're not developing it for a bomb. We're developing nuclear power, that usual song. And of course, Pakistan is a nuclear power today. Just historically speaking, their enemy, India, had kicked Pakistan's ass 3 times in wars. They got the bomb, I think, as early as 1974. Pakistan, it would take a while longer, but they got it in 1998. Charlie actually rode into battle at one point with the Mujahideen. It was his request. He wanted to do it. And that was a big deal. Totally illegal from a U.S. perspective, but he did do it, not in the movie. Also, an interesting story in the book that was not in the movie was the fact that they had these huge planes flying to Pakistan with some weapons and then coming home empty. And at one point, it was arranged that the injured Afghan soldiers that were being treated in Pakistan were flown back to the U.S. for more advanced treatment, where a couple of them actually tried to kill each other in a hospital. That could have made a nice scene. This goes back to this, not so much a nation, but a collection of warring tribes, not even a people, because you take these 2 soldiers from different tribes while they're in Afghanistan, you put them in a hospital in, Texas, and they try to kill each other. That's just the reality of the culture at the time. So, the net results of the war. No one knows for sure the Soviet deaths. One estimate is only 15,000, with another 50,000 wounded. To put that in perspective, Russian deaths in Ukraine, I just saw an article, were 33,000 last month. 150 to 350,000 total, another 600,000 wounded in their modern war in Ukraine. Estimated, again, no one knows for sure, but I'm just putting it in perspective. I think the bigger damage to the Soviets was financial, although they did have to go out of their way as some of their soldiers were sent back to the villages from which they came, that there was a government-led denial that they died in Afghanistan. They painted up some phony story, and that's what was told to the parents. That's what was put on tombstones and so on. There was no mention that they died in Afghanistan. All right, what is the epilogue? So the Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan. The Geneva Accords in 1988 settled that. The last general for the Soviets walks across that friendship bridge I mentioned earlier. The same year, a plane went down carrying President Zia. He died. The Afghan clans start fighting each other almost immediately after the pullout. Now, here's a quote from the book. Foreboding crept into the minds of American officials as they thought of the hundreds of millions of dollars worth of weapons stored in mountain caves throughout Afghanistan. So they start to worry about the Mujahideen that had received the bulk of American support, as I alluded to earlier, and they end up being the most dangerous extremists for us in the war on terror, right? So what else happens then? The wall comes down in Berlin in 1989. The curtain comes down on the Soviet Union in 1991. Changing world history, really. Right before that, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. That was 1990. The Afghan warlords, not surprisingly, back Hussein, at least verbally. So upon our invasion of Iraq under Bush 1, the love affair with America is over in Afghanistan. It ended that quickly. The CIA, with Saudi money, though, actually kept putting weapons and money into Afghanistan to push out what it saw was a puppet regime that was Najibullah. So we're kind of doing the same thing that the Soviets did when they invaded for the similar reasons, right? But the most dangerous man in Afghanistan was Hekmatyar, Joanne's favorite warlord, as it turns out. And Hekmatyar, after the Soviets leave, he's bombing residential neighborhoods. He's creating a humanitarian crisis using the weapons which we funded and left behind. The so-called puppet government was actually saying the right things at the time in hindsight, and the Mujahideen were becoming the extremists, as we would call them today. In April 1992, Mujahideen took Kabul. In 1993, Pakistani murdered 2 CIA employees outside of headquarters in Virginia. I was not familiar with the story until I did the research for this episode. He actually escaped to Pakistan. It was 4 years before he was captured and returned to the U.S., tried, convicted, and executed in 2002. But just goes to show you, like, Pakistan was our ally just 4 years earlier in the war against Afghanistan. We gave them a lot of things. They helped us. And that just goes right out the window very quickly. A month after that CIA shooting was the first World Trade Center bombing. Hekmatyar was prime minister of Afghanistan for a while until, ironically, the Taliban took over Kabul and forced him to flee to Iran after about 1996. And for the rest of the decade, Afghanistan became a gathering place for militant Muslims around the world, with 30,000 volunteers flooding into Pakistan alone to take part in the Holy War, whatever that meant at the time. Clinton put Pakistan on the terrorist list. Again, just a 180-degree turn from our relationship under Charlie Wilson. That felt like a betrayal to the Pakistanis that helped us a decade earlier, And with U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, Islamists believe the U.S. want to seize Islamic oil fields and combine that with the victory over the Soviets. And the Islamist militants believe they had God's power behind them and could defeat anyone. That was kind of a psychological effect of beating the Soviets, so to speak. The humanitarian aid to Afghanistan stopped. No schools, no roads. The U.S. left a mess and a void. And the Taliban and Osama bin Laden filled that void. Putin comes to power in 1999. 12 years after the end of the war, Charlie Wilson is working as a lobbyist because, of course, and then 9/11 happens. And there were fighters in Afghanistan we supported, like Jalaluddin Haqqani, that would later become top targets of ours after 9/11 during the War on Terror in Afghanistan. The CIA tried to assassinate Hekmatyar, but failed. He's still alive, by the way. And before he retired, he tried to get $1 billion. This is Charlie now, for some kind of Marshall Plan for Afghanistan, but could not get the money. There's a scene late in the movie, again, where he's at that table with fewer and fewer people, and they say, no one cares anymore, Charlie. So he gets some money, but it's a pittance. And as I said, Pakistan was working on the bomb the whole time, and we shifted views and tried sanctions to stop them, including not sending them weapons they'd already paid for, but they got the bomb anyway. And that is probably more than you ever want to know about Charlie Wilson's war, but I think now listening to it, you hopefully appreciate how important and relevant it was to U.S. history specifically and world history generally. And we're going to get into, I think next week, I think I found a book and a movie on the FBI ABSCAM sting, which will be a little bit more fun than the last few that I've done, as you will see. So this has been Lemmy. This has been episode 7 of Based on an Almost True Story about Charlie Wilson's War. See you out there.